Good morning on this early Thursday, August 23rd. This is a 28storms.com update on Tropical Storm Isaac. As of the latest 5 a.m. Eastern Time advisory from the National Hurricane Center, maximum sustained winds are still only 40 miles per hour, and the storm has slowed down just a little bit. The movement is now toward the west at 12 miles per hour, and the latest coordinates are 15.3 degrees north and 64.0 degrees west. The current latitude is somewhat interesting because the center of circulation did at least slightly relocate toward the south, and this could still have some minor implications with the forecast track. Nonetheless, this is the current forecast from the National Hurricane Center. They do still think that Isaac will become a Category 1 before impacting Haiti, but due to a lot of land interaction, the storm could temporarily weaken back to a tropical storm, and it's not until 2 a.m. Monday that Isaac is forecast to become a hurricane for a second time, as it becomes a Category 1 as it's passing over the Florida Keys. And finally, the forecast wraps up at day 5 with a track somewhere to the west of Tampa by 2 a.m. on Tuesday, and this general track is implying a long-range threat somewhere out across the Big Bend region of Florida or the central and eastern half of the Florida Panhandle. The latest model intensity guidance does show steady strengthening throughout the forecast period, but many of the models keep Isaac as a tropical storm or just a Category 1 hurricane, and this is due to the expected land interaction over the next 3 to 4 days with the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Cuba. But keep in mind there are still major questions regarding the forecast track, and any deviation could allow for the intensity forecast to be significantly altered. The 6Z run of the tropical model suite is in fairly good agreement with a turn more toward the west-northwest within the next 12 to 24 hours, and that is why they are going with a track over Haiti and eastern Cuba. There's also a fairly good consensus at around day 4 with a track somewhere very close to the Florida Keys and the southeast Gulf of Mexico, so the Hurricane Center is pretty much right in the middle of this forecast swath, with the storm headed toward the Florida Panhandle within 5 to 6 days. The 0Z run of the GFS ensemble members are also in fairly good agreement with this idea. You can see that so many of the ensembles are out across western Haiti and Cuba that you really can't make out those land masses. And the same can be said for much of the Florida Peninsula, although the GFS ensemble mean is just barely off the west coast of Florida near Tampa, with a final landfall somewhere out across the Big Bend region. The regional water vapor satellite shows that the outflow associated with Tropical Storm Isaac continues to look very well defined, and this is a good indication that the upper level vertical wind shear remains light. And the real reason why Isaac is continuing to pretty much stay at nearly the same intensity over the past couple of days is still that the dry air is entraining into the center of the circulation. But over time, it still looks as though that conditions are going to become increasingly favorable, if not just for the land interaction with Hispaniola and Cuba, as the models are currently showing a bend more toward the west-northwest within the next 24 hours, so we're still pretty close with that overall idea. As we take a more zoomed-in approach to the latest satellite imagery, although Isaac looks somewhat impressive, the latest reconnaissance data does confirm that the surface circulation remains ill-defined, and in fact the hurricane hunters have estimated the center to be situated somewhat to the north of all of this deepest convection, and you can see this also on the enhanced infrared, and you also see a secondary spin to the southwest. This is more than likely the mid-level circulation, so we do still have a decoupling between the surface center and the mid-level center, and until those two become vertically stacked, the storm is not going to steadily intensify, and we should anticipate only slow strengthening over the next 12 to 18 hours. And over the course of Thursday, it's going to be very important to try and figure out where exactly Isaac will finally consolidate. If it's more toward the northwest in the line of the forecast track, then that should not alter what the expectations are all that much. However, if the storm remains relatively weak and on a westward heading for a prolonged period of time, then that would give more credit to the ECMWF model solution, which is keeping the storm just far enough to the south and weak to where it does not quite feel the impacts of the troughing that is going to at least temporarily set up out across the Bahamas and South Florida. Furthermore, the 48-hour sea level pressure forecast from the Europeans shows that Hispaniola is not going to help the storm organize in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it still shows a rather disorganized structure of Tropical Storm Isaac as we go into Friday night, and that is why as we go into the 72-hour time frame, this particular model is still keeping Isaac along the southeast coast of Cuba, whereas the GFS and some of the other models are already over the northern coast by this time. All that being said, by 96 hours, there's still not much disagreement now between the GFS and the European, If anything, the European is still ever so slightly to the south of the GFS, which is closer to the Florida Keys. And as we go into day 5, the European is also a bit slower with the forecast motion. And this is still late Monday night. The storm is along the western half of the Florida Keys or in the extreme southeast Gulf of Mexico. But there is still one key difference, and that is the European is still showing more in the way of ridging and a weaker trough out across the Tennessee and Ohio Valley. Therefore, as we go into day 6 and day 7, although the European has trended more toward the east within the last 24 hours, it is still to the west of most of the model guidance by showing a final landfall as a significant hurricane between Pensacola and Mobile Bay. The latest look at the 0Z ECMWF ensemble mean also proves that if the storm were to remain somewhat weaker, it would have the tendency to remain along the southern coast of Cuba, and that is exactly what the European ensembles are showing as we go into day 4. Therefore, as we go into day 5 and day 6, the European ensembles continue to be to the west or just west of many of the other model guidance, and although I think the ECMWF ensembles are too weak with development out across the central and eastern Gulf, they are a good representation as to how far west the track can go if indeed the storm remains weaker over the next 2 to 3 days. The latest 6Z run of the GFS just became available as we were cutting this video, and this is a look at the 850 millibar vorticity pattern, and this allows us to determine where the GFS has the main center beginning to form over the next 24 hours. And interestingly enough, as we fast forward this into the next 12 to 18 hour period, for whatever reason the GFS still has the main vortmax approaching the southern coast of Puerto Rico, and based on the current satellite trends, that still appears to be just way too far to the north. Isaac could surprise us if this GFS solution were to verify, and this could have some implications on the forecast track, but nonetheless this is what the GFS is going with, and it's also still going with the track along the northern coast of Cuba, and that is where the European and the GFS begin to have some disagreements. But either way, this is the latest GFS track, and it's taking the storm towards South Florida and the Florida Keys, and the current timetable for this is the early morning hours of Monday, and by Monday night and Tuesday morning the storm is moving over Tampa and well on its way to moving into the Big Bend region of Florida for a final landfall. This is the 0Z run of the CMC model, and for viewers that have been tuning in to 28storms.com outlooks for the past 3 days would know that the CMC has been by far the northern and easternmost model solution, and this is oftentimes a bias from the CMC that is often incorrect. And despite that bias, even the CMC has shifted westward with its solution. Before, it was well out across the Bahamas with a potential recurvature situation away from Florida, and now the latest 0Z run is showing a track that takes it directly up the Florida Peninsula from Miami to Orlando, up into Ocala, and then finally into Georgia. So interests along the east central and northeast coast of Florida up into Georgia and the Carolinas are still advised to closely watch Isaac over the next 48 to 72 hours, as there is still that outside possibility that the tracks begin to deviate back toward the east. But as of right now, the areas that are of the highest risk for a landfall are the southern and western coast of Florida, and even the central Gulf of Mexico should also be watching Isaac's progress over the coming week. I would also like to mention that despite several models not showing Isaac becoming a major hurricane, any deviation away from some of the higher terrain of Cuba or more of a track into the open waters of the southeast Gulf would place the storm over very warm sea surface temperatures and in an environment that has very little in the way of vertical wind shear. So the hurricane potential is still very high over the eastern Gulf, and the track is going to make all the difference. So with all things considered, we are slightly more conservative with the intensity forecast over the next 24 to 48 hours. The Hurricane Center does expect Isaac to be a hurricane before approaching Haiti. We're not quite as certain about that. This is probably going to be a strong tropical storm in our opinion, and that is based on the reports from the hurricane hunters that the current surface circulation is still somewhat ill-defined, and the land interaction with Hispaniola as the storm begins to gain latitude is not going to help the current structure. So over the next 2 to 3 days, we are more in line with the European forecast, with a slightly weaker storm passing along the southern portion of the Cuban coastline, and a weaker storm will have the tendency to pull a little bit more toward the west. So we are more in favor with the European solution of the storm being located a little closer to the northwest tip of Cuba compared to the Florida Keys. But even with this more westerly position, the Florida Keys would potentially be receiving hurricane force winds, so it doesn't look like there's too many ways for the Florida Keys to avoid at least some significant weather from Isaac. And keep in mind the GFS does place the storm directly over extreme South Florida, including the Keys at this time, so we are slightly more toward the west in that regard. Finally, due to the better agreement between the GFS, the European, and the remainder of the model consensus, we are turning the storm more toward the north-northwest as we go into day 5. And due to the water temperatures and favorable vertical wind shear being forecast by the dynamical models, we think that the storm will try to reach Category 2 intensity despite having been over Cuba for an extended period of time. So all interests across the central and eastern Gulf of Mexico and pretty much everyone within the state of Florida should be paying attention to Isaac, because if the model starts to shift back toward the east, then this would place the entire Florida peninsula within the line of fire. So certainly no one is quite out of the woods just yet. And also remember that this is an unofficial forecast. If you're going to be making any life or death decisions, you need to be using the latest products from the National Hurricane Center. But please keep it tuned to 28storms.com for more secondary information. We will be providing more video analysis and blog updates. And also we have a special treat tonight as we go into Thursday night and Friday morning at 12 a.m. Eastern Time. We will be having a live video discussion, and you can join in the chat room and ask us questions while we are live on the air. So you may want to check that out later on.